A long time ago, there was a man who started a widget factory, a factory that makes widgets. And at the widget factory, he would make the widgets, sell the widgets, ship the widgets, and get paid. Inside of the widget factory, he had a widget making machine. This widget making machine was responsible for making the widgets so that he could sell the widgets, ship the widgets, and get paid. And he did very well with it. Did so well, in fact, that he had to hire employees to help him run this widget making machine, to make these widgets, ship the widgets so he could get paid. One day, the widget making machine broke down. It didn't work anymore. And the man and his employees went crazy. They were thinking, what are we going to do about our widget machine? If the widget machine doesn't work, we can't make widgets. If we can't make widgets, we can't get paid. So they crawled in and around and over the machine, and they looked everywhere they could to figure out why the widget making machine no longer worked. They couldn't figure it out. So they called a consultant. And the consultant came in to the widget factory, looked at the widget making machine, examined it pretty closely, climbed over it, under it, around it, looked around. And the consultant then took out a single piece of chalk. And the consultant walked over to the widget making machine and made 2 marks on the widget making machine. So the best cutter in the factory came and cut right here and cut right here, removed the metal between the 2 chalk marks. The owner of the factory went behind the machine to the big red switch, lifted the switch, and the machine worked again. And the machine was making the widgets so they could ship the widgets, sell the widgets, get paid, and everybody was happy. The man who owned the factory was happy, and the man who owned the factory turned to the consultant and said, "This is amazing. You're an amazing consultant. Thank you. What do I owe you?" And the consultant said to the man who owns the factory, "You owe me $10,000. US dollars. $10,000 US. And the man who owned the factory says, "Wait a second, $10,000, you were only here for 15 minutes. You expect me to pay you $10,000 for 15 minutes of work? You need to give me an itemized invoice of exactly what you did to justify $10,000 for 15 minutes of work." So the consultant pulled out a pad of paper and started writing. Wrote up the invoice right there on site, tore off that piece of paper, handed it to the man who owns the factory. The factory owner looked at that invoice, looked it up and down, studied it very carefully, nodded his head, and paid that consultant $10,000. What was on the invoice? I'll read it to you now. Invoice paid. I'll read it to you now. Line 1 of the invoice. Of course, invoice in big block letters at the top, right? Line 1 of the invoice. Line 1 of the invoice said, piece of chalk, $1. Line 2, knowing what to do with the chalk, $9,999. My name is Ray Hightower. And as Michael said during the introduction, I own a software company called Wisdom Group. We build software for the web. We run the Chicago Ruby User Group and a couple of conferences in Chicago, Windy City Rails and Windy City Things. And that's enough about me. I'm going to talk to you about really open source and knowing what to do with the chalk. Because a lot of what we do is knowing what to do, how to solve the problems that are out there. And I need to share with you, and I need to emphasize with you, and you know this already, knowing what to do with the chalk is not about tricking clients, it's about delivering value. You know, that's a funny little story at the beginning. You know, knowing what to do with the chalk, it's not about tricking clients, it's about delivering value. That company owner was in trouble. The consultant who came in to solve that problem rescued that company and rescued the jobs of all of those employees, indeed. So it's about delivering value. So today, as we spend some time together, we're going to talk about ways that open source enables us to deliver value. Many of you have read this book, The Cathedral and the Bazaar. It's one of the seminal works on open source out there, written by Raymond. And it talks about open source, the what and the whys behind open source. You know, what is open source software and why do we care? Why is it that people are willing to give software away for free, give away this hard work for free? And we'll talk about that. You know, you're giving some things away, but you're getting some things in return at the same time. And that's covered in The Cathedral and the Bazaar. Many of you in this room are deeply involved in open source. I went to GitHub and I can see, you know, Nairobi's got, you know, of course, GitHub account where you're doing a lot with open source. I found that your local Linux user group, of course, is doing a lot of things with open source. So if you're in this room, clearly you get what's going on with open source. Sometimes you may be in a situation where you need to explain open source to someone who's accustomed to the closed source world, the proprietary software world. And that can be a challenge at times, right? And as we know, open source is not about bashing Microsoft. Microsoft is a dominant player in closed source software, in proprietary software. But you know what? Microsoft is involved in open source too. They have a GitHub account. It blows me away that Microsoft has a GitHub account. How many, you know, many of you may be surprised by that too. I'm really surprised by it. You know, back in the day when Bill Gates was running the company, Bill Gates didn't give away jack. You know, how do you get to be a billionaire by giving away stuff, right? Well, there are ways. You know, you want to give away opportunities and give away certain things. But with open source, if it's done right, your secret sauce remains secret and you decide what to share. For example, if you own a company, say you own a banking company and you want to do something where you're making mobile payments available maybe in the fashion of M-Pesa. I'm hearing more about M-Pesa now that I'm here in Kenya, so I want to learn more about that. But say you own a company or starting a company that is doing something with payments online or banking online. One of the most important aspects of payments or banking online, anytime you are dealing with somebody else's money, one of the most important things is security. But it's not your secret sauce. The secret sauce is really the service you provide to your customers. So what we find is that many times banks will get together with their competitors, with competing banks or with competing financial service companies to share best practices around security. And that's how things like OWASP have come to be, and that's how secure sockets layer and transport layer security have come about through these collaborations between companies which on the outside, which ostensibly appear to be competitors, and they are competitors. They compete fiercely when it comes to customer service and satisfying customers and getting paid by customers. But when it comes to security, they want to share information so that they're all secure because they have that common thread. So that's an example of where open source really does extremely well, where they want to share information with each other about how to make their environments and make their systems secure. A poster child for open source is a company that's based in my hometown in Chicago, Illinois, back in the States, BaseCamp. And, you know, of course, if you're at a Ruby conference, you've heard of BaseCamp, you know that BaseCamp was the very first Ruby on Rails application. BaseCamp was created by a company which at the time was called 37 Signals, and many of you know this story already. 37 Signals, the founder of 37 Signals, Jason Fried, had a problem. He and his team needed to manage the flow, their workflow, the work that they were doing for their clients more effectively. So he engaged a developer in Copenhagen, Denmark, David Hannemeyer Hansen, and together they built BaseCamp. Once BaseCamp was complete, David looked at it and said, you know, there are some things in this BaseCamp application, this web-based project management application that we want to extract that we can use to build other applications. So that's what he did. He extracted some things, certain things like object relational mapping, you know, active record, which is responsible for mapping between your OO theory and what's going on in your database. And the structure, the model view controller structure, he had extracted those from BaseCamp and bundled that into something called Ruby on Rails. And that's how Ruby on Rails came about. And it's a remarkable story because all of this is happening around the world. You know, in this case in particular, you've got Chicago, where Jason is, Copenhagen, where David is. You know, they're collaborating on BaseCamp. Ruby, the language that BaseCamp was written in, was created by Yukihiro Matsumoto. It was created in Osaka, Japan. And right here in Nairobi, we have Nairuby, and we have teams of people right here who are building apps in Ruby and in Rails right now. And so all of this is happening all over the world, and we're all collaborating through GitHub and through other tools. As you know, I don't need to tell you this, with open source, we want to make sure that we watch our licensing with open source. Because while you want to give away certain things, you want to give away not your secret sauce, but you want to give away things that other people in the community can help you with, you don't want to accidentally give away secret sauce. There's a story of a company that inadvertently, because they used some open source libraries in their router firmware, they ended up turning their router firmware into open source, and they didn't mean to do it. And if you're interested in that story, if you Google DD-WRT, that's how it became open source. Linksys did not intentionally want DD-WRT to be open source. It was an accident. And if you dig deep enough, you can read about it. It turns out to be a happy accident. It's helping them in the long run, but you don't want to be the one who loses your business because of some licensing that's going on. I love this. This is Linus Torvalds when he first began writing an operating system. Do you see what he thought about it? I'm doing a free operating system. It's not going to be that big. It's just going to be tiny. And it ended up being Linux that all of us are using right now. So we have no idea what this is going to grow in. Some of the things that we're working on right now in our user groups and at our conferences could potentially grow into something that may be as large as Linux, or may be large in a way that we cannot predict right now. And that was Linus Torvalds. That, you know, amazing how that grows in ways that we can't predict. Of course, as we mentioned, the big thing in open source, of course, we want to share information on security. How many of you go to this Norse site, the Norse Network Map site? This is almost addictive. What you're seeing in real time is attacks. The attacks and the attacked going on the internet right now. And if you're interested in the URL, the slides for this, I'll make sure that those are up at rayhightower.com, and you can pull the URL off of there. But you can see in real time attacks and the attacked that are happening in real time. And this is an example of a case where people who are being attacked want to share what's going on so that they can collaborate and together figure out how to prevent these attacks and how to protect themselves from the attacks. Open source helps us in that in many ways through tools like OpenSSL. We'll talk about Eclipse. Interesting story about Eclipse. I've mentioned this to some of you. I'm very active in an organization in the Boy Scouts of America back in the States. And youth organization, you know, we're helping youth between 11 and 17, young men, young boys between 11 and 17 move from boyhood to manhood. And we're camping, and we're also doing things with open source software and Arduinos and that type of thing. One day I'm in a room full of kids, and you know how kids are, 11, 12-year-old kids, they're loud and, you know, yelling at each other and doing all that stuff. Room full of kids, and I'm on my laptop doing something scouting related. I don't remember exactly what I was doing, but it was something scouting related. And one of the kids, an 11-year-old kid, comes up behind me, looks over my shoulder, and he says, what are you doing on your laptop? So I show him, and I tell him, you know, I was working on a spreadsheet or something. I tell him, you know, what I'm doing. And then, so I turn to him, I say, what do you do with your laptop? And he said, Eclipse. And I'm thinking, all right, this kid's 11. Maybe there's a game called Eclipse that I don't know about. So, you know, I want to get some information about this. So I turned to him and said, so tell me about Eclipse. And this 11-year-old says to me, if I'm playing a game and the game is written in Java and I want to win the game, I pull the source code into Eclipse, modify it, recompile it, and then I can win the game. This kid's 11. And what's so exciting is that not only is it exciting what he's doing at age 11, even more exciting is what he'll be doing when he's 21, right? What kind of companies will kids like that be starting? So it's important to make sure we're exposing them to this. And in fact, in many cases, we don't really need to expose them to it. They're motivated to win these games, right? And so they'll get in there and they'll teach us. And that's what's happening in many cases. So we talked about open source. Let's talk about entrepreneurship for a few minutes, and then we're going to tie open source and entrepreneurship together and wrap this whole thing up into a neat package. For the purpose of this discussion, for the purpose of this presentation, an entrepreneur is anyone who can start, significantly expand, or transform an enterprise. Start, significantly expand, or transform an enterprise. And the exciting thing about entrepreneurship is that it doesn't necessarily have to happen inside of a business. It can happen inside of government. It can happen inside of not-for-profit. We'll look at a government example. And if you haven't seen this TED video, I encourage you to hop online and see it. Not while I'm talking to you, of course, but I encourage you to hop online and watch this video by Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala is a 21-year veteran of the World Bank and former finance minister of Nigeria. And what's remarkable about her record, what's remarkable is that as finance minister of Nigeria, she went into this position when the nation was in debt, very badly in debt. Oh, that's a very big bug, isn't it? Flying. The nation of Nigeria was very badly in debt when Dr. Okonjo-Iweala went into office as finance minister. And when she left, they had a $30 billion surplus, 30 billion US surplus when she left. And she did that through sound financial management and discipline and making people pay what they owed, and she talks about that in detail in her video. One of the things that I really like about what she talks about is that, there's these stereotypes about the African continent. First of all, there's some people in the U.S. who still think Africa is a country. I bash people like that every time that comes up. There are stereotypes like, when you think about corruption, you think about Africa, think about poverty, think about Africa. And the point that Dr. Okonjo-Iweala raises is that those are stereotypes and you have corruption everywhere. I mean, most recently, the Panama Papers. Did you see that? There was a video, you'll see this on YouTube, the Prime Minister of Iceland, they were interviewing him and they surprised him with a question about the Panama Papers, and his first response was to pretend like he didn't know what was going on. Like you do when you're a little kid and your parents catch you doing something you're not supposed to do. So he's on camera, just so, couldn't get it out. And then his second response was to rip off the microphone and run away from the camera. Vladimir Putin has been named in the Panama Papers. So, this corruption thing, it's a human thing. It's worldwide. But the things that Dr. Okonjo-Iweala mentions and focuses on in her TED Talk is the idea of doing business. Let's figure out how to do business together, because if we work together on all of this, we can all benefit. If we negotiate well, a good negotiation is the result of a good negotiation is when both parties win. You establish a win-win relationship. Knowing what to do with the chalk is about establishing win-win relationship. That consultant, after making those marks and charging that fee, yes, it was a large fee, but there was huge benefit because that widget company owner was able to get that widget machine going again. So knowing what to do with the chalk is establishing that win-win relationship. And in this video on TED, the presenter is sharing that in a big and powerful way. So I would encourage you to look at it. It's about 18 minutes long. Typical TED Talk's about 18 minutes long. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. And that's entrepreneurship in government. I had to find an example. There's tons of entrepreneurship examples in business. This is in government, and it's executed in a very excellent and very effective way. So let's tie open source and entrepreneurship together. Where are some examples of where this is tied together? First example I need to talk about is an organization in Chicago called Blue 1647. Remarkable started by a young man named Emil Cambry. And what they do is, it is a hacker space, and it is a maker space, and it is a co-working space. There are some young companies that are there in this incubator space that are starting off there. And there are courses taught on technology, on learning how to code, and how to learn the CNC machines and the 3D printing machines and injection molding and devices that you need to manufacture goods and to manufacture software. And this is, if you check it out at blue1647.com, you'll find more about this. But I'm excited about this because the team at Blue 1647, they're blending open source and entrepreneurship, not only to manage their operations very effectively, but to teach this to other people. And they also happen to be running the youth program at Windy City Things, which is one of the conferences that my team is running in Chicago. So we're really excited about them. Check out Blue 1647 when you get a chance. Here in Kenya, we heard about this in the States. Njeri Chilimo. Miss Chilimo, somebody in this audience must know her because from what the impression I get about her is that she's very driven and very creative. But the issue was this young woman at the age of 19 wanted to go to a hacker school in the United States and was all set, did all of her prep work, did all the technology prep work that she had to do to prepare to go to this hacker school in the United States, and her visa was denied. This is a young woman, 19 years old, prepared to go to the US to learn this stuff, and her visa was denied. And she could have, sat down at home and cried about it, but what she decided is, you see the quote, if I can't go to the hacker school, I'm going to bring the hacker school to me. And she's one of the people who started a hacker school in Nairobi, and I'm very anxious to meet her and some of the people connected with her. I understand she bounces between Nairobi and San Francisco now, so I don't know that I'll meet her. Maybe someone here can introduce me. I'll talk to you about that afterwards. But, I got to emphasize this quote because I love it. I thought if I can't go to the hacker school, let me try to bring the school to me. This is entrepreneurship. The whole idea about entrepreneurship, start, significantly expand, or transform an enterprise. Just run through walls when there's an obstacle in front of you, go over it, under it, around it, or through it. And I love this spirit, and it's right here in Kenya, and I've got to meet more people like this. It's wonderful. Another young woman, this is Tiffany Ashley Bell, based in the United States, graduate of Howard University in the US. Tiffany Ashley Bell discovered that there were people in Detroit, Michigan, in the US that were getting their water service cut off due to non-payment of bills. And a lot of times it was for crazy stuff, for whatever reason. Non-payment of bill, and your water is cut off. And, in the United States, here's, talk about the whole poverty thing. This is in the United States. There are impoverished communities in the USA. We're not supposed to talk about that. Well, I'm an American, and I'll tell you about it. We have our own sets of problems, right? So Ms. Bell, Tiffany Ashley Bell, what she decided to do is, rather than just complain about it, she used her software development skills. She built an app in Ruby on Rails to match people who can pay for water bills with people who were in need of having their water bills paid. And she launched it. It was called the Detroit Water Project. Took off really well. She is expanding it to other cities, has since changed the name to the Human Utility. And if you know Tiffany, she has spoken at Windy City Rails, is speaking at Windy City Rails again this year. You know her, she has a bigger vision than just water in Detroit. The fact that she's renamed this as the Human Utility means that she's attacking some other problems beyond Detroit and beyond just water. They've expanded into Baltimore, Maryland. Stay tuned. You got to watch this young lady. Remarkable stuff. Really remarkable software development skills, entrepreneurship skills, beautiful blend of open source and entrepreneurship right here on this planet. All right, now that I've gotten you fired up about open source and entrepreneurship and software development, let's talk about tractors. That's a tractor. That's a tractor in Italy made by an Italian tractor manufacturer. Young man in Italy started a tractor company, became very successful with this tractor company, and made a lot of tractors, made a lot of money, did what a lot of young men do when they make a lot of money building tractors or whatever it is they build. He went out and bought himself a Ferrari automobile, a Ferrari sports car. Why not? Let's have fun. So he's driving his Ferrari around Italy, having fun, he's making tractors, driving his Ferrari, having a lot of fun driving around his Ferrari. And one day his Ferrari breaks down. He's like, what's going on? This is a Ferrari. I paid a lot of money for this. It broke down. So he pulls over to the side of the road, gets out. He's a tractor maker, so he knows something about mechanics and engines and all this. He looks under the hood. Then he crawls underneath the car and he's looking around. And in the process of looking his Ferrari over very carefully, he notices that the clutch in the Ferrari is identical to the clutch that he uses in his tractors. Interesting, right? So, young man gets on the phone, calls up Enzo Ferrari. Mr. Enzo Ferrari. He says, hey, Mr. Ferrari, I have one of your Ferrari automobiles, and I noticed the clutch you use in your Ferrari automobile is the same as the clutch that I use in my tractors. You can do better than that. And by the way, I have some suggestions and recommendations for you on steering. You can get better steering, and here's how you can do that. And the braking, here's how you can do better brakes in the car, and transmission, you should listen to me about this. And the young man's going on and on about all of this stuff. And Enzo Ferrari is listening to this, and finally, the older man, Mr. Ferrari, the older man says, young man, I'm Mr. Ferrari. I make Ferraris. You make tractors. Take your behind back to your tractor factory and you go make your tractors and let me go make my Ferraris. And the young man listened to this and he said, okay, hung up the phone. He said, yeah, I'm going to go back to my tractor factory. And he kept making his tractors. He still makes tractors today, but while he was making his tractors, he decided, he was going to make something else. He decided to make sports cars. And the young man in making his sports cars, he makes his sports cars today, and there are people today who argue that this young man's sports cars are as good as, or maybe even better than Ferrari. That young man's name is Lamborghini. And that's a Lamborghini, and that's hot. So you may ask me, Ray, why are you talking about tractors and Lamborghinis and, this is Ruby and this is open source and, did you just want an excuse to show a sports car at a Ruby conference? Well, yeah. But also, it ties into open source because what Lamborghini did when he got out of his Ferrari to look around at it is he was looking at the hardware. He was able to open the hood himself and he was able to do something about it. And I love this quote from DHH about this. You can whine about something or you can get in under the hood and look at it. And what's so cool about open source, all of us have GitHub accounts in this room. You don't like something about Linux, fork Linux and fix it. And then submit a pull request to Linus Torvalds. And, be careful because, Linus Torvalds has a reputation for being very vocal about whether he likes or doesn't like something, right? But that's okay. That's the nature of the beast right here. But the example of the Ferrari and the Lamborghini, that is an example of looking at something, seeing that it can be changed, seeing that it can be improved and done better, and doing something about it. Now, what if we had open source hardware? Wouldn't that be cool? Well, it is cool, and we do have open source hardware. I've spoken with some of you prior to getting up here on stage. Some of you are doing some cool stuff with Arduinos, and Arduinos are remarkable. They started off, $50 a piece, and now there are stores in the States right now where you can buy an Arduino for $6 a piece. What a decrease in pricing. That's almost like 9 to 1, right? Drastic decrease in pricing, right? And so these are accessible to everybody. And Arduinos, the language is accessible as well. They're accessible financially and accessible in terms of the language. The language, it's not C, but it looks a lot like C. And there are tons of examples on GitHub and elsewhere where we can learn how to program this thing, of course. All open source. That's a Raspberry Pi. Again, an example of the blending of open source and entrepreneurship. And you know the story of the Raspberry Pi. Some professors in the UK decided that the kids coming into the CS program at their university did not know enough about writing software before they came into the computer science program. And they figured it was because there were no longer any inexpensive computers available for them to play with as kids. So they created Raspberry Pi. Again, started off at about $50, which was in and of itself very inexpensive for a Linux computer. That's a Raspberry Pi screenshot. It runs Linux, as you know. And now, most recently, the Raspberry Pi Zero, they were giving these away in magazines. You can get a Pi Zero for about $5, and they can't keep them in the stores. $5 a piece for a computer that can run Linux. It's amazing, and it boggles my mind that we can do this. And if you want it to be more powerful and to run more stuff, you can tie them together into a supercomputer, as this father and son team did in the UK. 64 Raspberry Pi computers tied together into a supercomputer. It's all doable, it's open source and available. And I'll give you a sneak peek. Tomorrow I'm going to be sharing with you Parallella, which is an open source computer, runs Linux, 18 cores, and you can fit it in your hand. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Open source hardware can be combined to create more open source hardware. OpenROV is a submarine. That's a remotely operated submarine. You drive it with a web browser. You tie your computer to it, you drive it with a web browser, you toss it in the water, you can see what's going on in the depths of the ocean or the depths of a lake. And inside, it's a BeagleBone Black. BeagleBone Black competes against Raspberry Pi, about the same size, also runs Linux, and an Arduino and some other hardware that they've put together. And that's the OpenROV in action, underwater, being controlled from the surface through a web browser. We're getting close to the end of the talk right now, so we're going to wrap things up and tie things together. Open source, entrepreneurship, and efficiency of locomotion. That's a condor. Huge bird, like a 10 or 11-foot wingspan. And condors, when they fly, they spread their wings and they're just riding the air currents, and they're very efficient in the way they use their energy. They use a very small amount of energy to go a long distance. In fact, Steve Jobs, years ago when he was a teenager, Steve Jobs was reading in a magazine about the condor and a bunch of other animals, and about the efficiency of locomotion of various animals compared to humans. And of all the animals out there, the condor was the most efficient in its use of energy. When it wanted to get somewhere, it would spread its wings and just fly, just float on a current of air. You compare the condor and compare other animals against humans, humans are not as efficient. When we want to run and go somewhere, we sweat and we run, all that stuff. We use a lot of energy to go a relatively small amount of distance. We're not as efficient in our use of energy when we're moving around, when we're locomoting, if that's a word, when we're moving around. Someone in this article had the bright idea to compare the condor to a human on a bicycle. And it makes sense, right? Humans, we have brains, we have our opposable thumbs, we are tool makers. And when they compared the human on a bicycle to a condor, humans smoked the condor. We were so much more efficient than the condor because through using our brains and using our opposable thumbs, using our ability to build tools, to build effective tools, we were able to establish or create a way to achieve a greater efficiency of locomotion because we were using this tool called a bicycle. This article led Steve Jobs to observe that a computer is a bicycle for the mind. We are tool makers. It makes sense. A computer is just another tool that we use to be more effective. And I would submit to you that if a computer is a bicycle for the mind, then open source is a bicycle for entrepreneurship. Thank you for listening. I suppose we can do questions at this point, if there are any questions.
So were you the
I'm sorry, can you say?
Were you the richest man? Because you had the company.
Was I the richest? No. The question is, am I the widget man, the guy at the company? No. That is in some metaphor. No, I'm not the widget man. That's a fable that I love, you know. And that story, I tell you the history of that story. That story was told to me when I was 16, taking my first software class in high school. And that's one of the reasons I decided that I wanted to get into software development. I loved that idea of knowing what to do with the chalk. And, you know, delivering the value. Knowing what to do with the chalk, you know, as we talked about, that is all about delivering value to our customers. When we deliver value, they want to pay us. Thank you for thinking that, though. You're very kind. Oh, yeah. Yes. Any other questions? I look forward to talking to all of you. I especially want to hear about M-Pesa because I hear that's very cool. So take me to school on that, please. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for listening. Oh, yeah, one question. Oh, yes.
Is there anything that you've done using Ruby on Rails that maybe we would know?
Oh, that you would know, that you would see out there? It depends. Most of the work that we're doing on Ruby on Rails, that my company that we're doing, is for companies that are serving clients in the States. There's some things that we're working on that will be global. You know, we're doing e-commerce sites, and you know what? We're building our own sites for our own ventures, for Windy City Rails and for Windy City Things. We're building those using Ruby, of course. And the back end, the parts of the system that takes the money and sells the tickets and sells whatever it is we're selling, those are all built on Ruby on Rails. So if you've ever heard of Windy City Rails or thought about going to Windy City Rails, you've used some of our work and it's written in Ruby on Rails. Or if you're thinking about going to the Internet of Things conference, Windy City Things, that's you know, Ruby on Rails for, we use Tito on the back end, and that's Ruby on Rails as well. Yeah, so you see that, yeah. We'll work on some other things that are more known to everybody all around. Yes, sir. Yes.
Talk to a company. So, like all the products are open source? If yes, why? If not, why?
Oh, yes. The question was, I run a software company. Are the products we create open source? If yes, why? If no, why? The short answer is yes. They're built on open source tools, but we're maintaining the secret sauce, right? So, for example, I'm thinking of an e-commerce company. It's built on Ruby on Rails. There's an opportunity to open source some libraries there, but of course, the core business model, of course, you want to maintain that because that's how you make your money. But it makes sense, you know, I'll go back to the chalk metaphor. It makes sense to share chalk with everybody because, you know, why not? You want other people to have their machines working too. But the exact, you know, the nature of what's going on inside of the widget machine, well, that's something that you might want to keep to yourself. And you know what? Sometimes it doesn't even matter if you keep it to yourself or not, because when I look at software development, we don't have to keep secret what we do. We could have our clients looking over our shoulder watching what we do, because what we do, it takes a lot of practice to get to the point where you can create good software. And the metaphor I use when talking to clients or talking to people who are not in software development, the metaphor I like to use is music. You know, some people say, oh, you can go to school and learn how to code in 9 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever, and you can learn some things about coding, certainly. You can develop some skills right there. But if you want to play music well enough to go to the most famous concert hall, you need to practice. You need to practice a lot, right? And you can let someone look over your shoulder. You can let them see the open source part of it. They can look over your shoulder, read your music, whatever, watch your fingers on the keys of your piano or what have you. But that doesn't mean that as soon as you play this complicated ragtime piece by Scott Joplin, that they can come in behind you and do the same thing unless they have also practiced. So I hope I answered your question. What I tend to do is when someone asks a question, I answer the question I want to answer, not necessarily what you ask me. That's what politicians do, right? So where'd you hide the money? Well, the important thing is education and healthcare. All right. I shouldn't bash politicians. Yes, I should? Okay, someone said I should. Oh, one question over here, this gentleman, yes.
You said you use Ruby on Rails in your company, right?
Yes.
I'm just wondering, are there any patterns that you find on Ruby on Rails that maybe you don't like in your company and then you develop your own?
The question is, are there any patterns that we find in Ruby on Rails that we don't like in our company and then we go out and develop our own? We haven't run into a lot. A lot of the applications that we are building are fit very much inside of the Rails framework. Now, there are isolated places where we will pull in another library to do something, to extend what Rails is doing for us. An example would be the D3 library for graphics. You know, if you want to display statistical graphics, D3.js is very effective for that. So D3 is written in JavaScript, so we might use that. So what we have found is in many cases we extend it. I know some people with Rails, you know how Rails has object relational mapping? It has active records so that your objects are mapped directly to your database. There's some people who will bypass that. They'll say, oh no, my queries are not, you know, are not executing quickly enough, so they'll write raw SQL in some cases. We haven't had to do that because most of our applications are for people who are in businesses, and the response time between what they see on the screen and the database connection is not the bottleneck. The bottleneck is going to be bandwidth, you know, the pipe to the website, you know, bandwidth or something like that. So we haven't had to rewrite that, but I know some people may have manually rewritten some SQL queries and that type of stuff. We haven't had to do that for what we're working with in our company. Mostly what we've done is we've added libraries to do something like I mentioned, D3, or a library to do something with a user interface that we want done for a client, that type of thing. So we've mostly extended the apps, you know, and Rails is like the central core, and then we've built onto it. That's what we do, yeah. And I'm going to want to ask you the same question too, but after this, yeah.